Now, what we have is, so the main functions of the nephron, there are three main functions. So filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So filtration is the filtering of chemicals, so from blood into urine. And when it's not quite urine yet, this is what we call forming urine. Now, where does this occur? Well, it occurs at the first interface between the nephron and the glomerulus. So this occurs at the renal corpuscle, where we have that ball of capillaries we call a glomerulus, and the capsule that surrounds that ball of capillaries. And what happens over here is that it's a very crude filter. It is a filter, but what happens is it basically pushes water and any small molecules through this crude filter. So it keeps things like cells and large molecules in the blood, but allows things like water, sugar, ions, and other small solutes to flow through. Reabsorption sounds like something, and these might be familiar terms if you remember the vessel physiology lectures. So reabsorption, again, re meaning again, so you're absorbing something again. Your first absorption was when you absorbed your nutrients and vitamins and molecules through your GI tract, but in terms of reabsorption, what happens is that even though you're pushing out these molecules through filtration, if you're claiming them and putting them back in your blood, that's reabsorption. And then secretion, now it's actively not just filtering it. Now your cells and your tissues in your urinary system, they're going to take chemicals it wants to get rid of and actively dump them into your nephrons. So that's what happens with secretion. So filtration and reabsorption, they oppose each other. Secretion is like filtration, but it doesn't occur at the renal corpuscle and actually involves active use of energy and transport to dump something into your urine. Here's another maybe hopefully familiar picture, and this is all the way back in our vessels lectures. Again, if you want more about these filtration and reabsorption, I'm going to retread slightly, but there we have our blood vessels playlist on YouTube. Alright, so then we have our filtration, and filtration moves liquid and substances out of the blood vessels. And not for this lecture, this was back in the blood vessels and capillary beds, but I'm just talking about general things. So again, filtration, moving fluids and solutes out of the blood vessel. Reabsorption, bringing fluids and fluids back in. Alright, so then what we have here is a more detailed view of the renal corpuscle. So what we have is, we have the afferent arterioles. Again, these are leading to the renal corpuscle. And then what we have are the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is a ball of capillaries, and the efferent arteriole is leading away from the glomerulus. So this is the direction of blood flow. Now you also have that structure that surrounds the glomerulus. It's not a naked capillary ball by itself. So it has a lining of cells as well, and this is called the Bowman's capsule, or I think in the Martini version they don't use Bowman's, they use glomerular capsule. One and the same thing. I think it's worth knowing Bowman's capsule because that's also a very common term. And then what you have is that if you notice the previous picture, the glomerulus is actually covered with all these other cells over here. So what we have is all these cells I'm going to represent as this dashed line over here. And these are what we call petty cells, which are parts of these special cells called podocytes. So those cells that are wrapping around the glomerulus, or the capillaries or the blood vessels that make up a glomerulus, these are called podocytes, and their little projections are called petty cells. And they kind of weave around and kind of wrap around a blood vessel. And what they are very rough filters. So the thing is that things can filter from these blood vessels between the little petty cells of these podocytes. So this is an entire podocyte, and each of these projections are called a petty cell. So what happens if you take all these petty cells and just do a cross section? Well, that's what we're seeing here. So it's like if you had someone's fingers and then cut them off, it would kind of look like this, right? Like little nubs. So that's what we're seeing here in this cross section right here, are little nubs of cut off petty or podocytes. And what's going to happen? Well, filtration happens at the renal corpuscle. And this is what we have here, is that we have pressure from inside the blood vessels and glomerulus pushing water and solutes from the capillaries into the surrounding space of the Bowman's capsule. So I'm going to flip this 90 degrees and show you another way of seeing how this filtration occurs. So what you have here are all of these blood endothelial cells that line that capillary, that glomerulus, and then you have all the blood over here. And there are small little pores in between the endothelial cells of the glomerulus. And then what's going to happen is that the blood pressure inside the glomerulus is going to cause fluid to filter between these little pores. But you also have a layer of petty cells formed by those podocytes. So you have a cellular, basically what you have is a cellular filter. And what's going to happen is that fluid is going to filter from the blood past these endothelial cells, past the petty cells. And I like to think of it as a big water filter. So if you had one of these water filters at home, what do? Well, you put it in there, put fluid in one end, and then through gravity and fluids are going to filter through this filter and come out the other side. And is it going to trap everything? It's not going to trap everything. It will trap a lot of larger particles, but you still need water to flow through. And if you have things that are very small, it might also filter through as well. So that's what happens with here. Like ions will still filter through, but big chunky particles and big particulates, they're not going to go through this filter. And what we have here, so now this fluid that actually makes it through from the blood vessels and finally past the petty cells, this is what we call filtrate. So it's no longer blood, it's no longer plasma, it's still fluid, it's still mostly water, but it's a different type of fluid we call filtrate. It's not quite urine yet. Alright, so another way I like to think of it is kind of like this. It's kind of like a very crude drain or sink trap. So when you have if you're putting things through this drain right here, you do get fluid that comes out the other end, but is it necessarily completely purified, and does it is it just plain water without anything else in it? Well, there are small particles that can still filter through, right? So same with your blood infiltrate. It traps most cells, or actually it traps cells, and traps most large particles and molecules, but still allows small things and liquid through.